the house, or and so it looks a little different now, but it brings them some nostalgia to look at that. Or even this was my own house, and now they changed it, or whatever the case is. So there's also my family and I. We went to Pittsburgh, where my great grandfather was when he got his American citizenship. And there was a house there that he lived in, and it was all over all of the documents and things like that. And it's still original, and there's still some of the original stained glass windows and stuff that would have been new when he was living there, and they're still there now. So it was really nice to look at and see some of that. In the book, I also tie a self-help guide if you're starting your own search and you're kind of, you don't know where to start or where to look. I put some flow charts, some sample searches, examples to help you guys design your own book, and various tips that I put throughout the book. Yeah, and then I go into the citizenship recognition. This is the documents that I turned into the consulate, the chart to finding out if you qualify. There's a couple different paths that you can qualify, either through a judicial or through the consulate network there. Some of my struggles with getting an appointment at the consulate, which was a big issue there. Apostilles and the next steps after you've turned documents in. Then I go into other sources of information, so some places to look, the DSCs, some city directories. Basically, I just leave no stone unturned. I look at all of the different places that you can find things, and navigating the National Archives, navigating USCIS, using the Comune for help that your family comes from, and then I even talk about some of the estimated costs that you could incur when going through the process. The tips from this book that we have already helped a couple people here at Casa Italia. I've helped people find some historical stuff already with using a lot of these tips, and hope to help some more people. So thank you, and if there's any questions.
When you're doing your own family book, I'm not familiar with your town in Sicily. Do you also include a map to show?
I do, yeah. So
yeah,
I'm passing the book around. It's one of the first pages. I've got the map. This is the area of Sicily right here, right next to Cefalo. I also kind of tie in when I go into World War II. I tie the map of when the invasions happened. I also carry a map here of the Venturella dispersion of my family throughout.
Thank you.
Yep.
When you were researching for your family citizenship, did they require you to spend 9 months in Italy?
No, they didn't.
That's what they told me.
Yeah. Every situation is a little bit different, and so I think that as people gain American citizenship and maybe even lose Italian citizenship, then I think that's where that requirement.
That's what he's talking about.
Yeah.
One more question. Royal race. Does people refer to a family? Am I correct? Royal is a family, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Sponsor the
Probably at first I would say.
it's a family. Family.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Very much. Our star students.
I'd also like to thank my sons back there and my wife who take care of us.
Okay, our next presenter is Arthur Cola. Arthur spent his career at Oak Park River Forest High School and in teaching and administration. And in retirement, he's got into writing novels. He's got a half dozen really compelling novels that reflect a lot of study in the field with a lot of big variety of subject matters going from Michelangelo to World War II. And so here to talk about VivI's War is Arthur Cola. Arthur, welcome.
VivI's War refers to a real-life person who happens to be my cousin. His nickname, I found out, is Vivi, but we only knew him as William Cola-WWII when we first met him. I think there's something in the water in Abruzzo, because I'm the third person to be talking about a story that takes place primarily in Abruzzo, which is my ancestral village. The entire story revolves around a story that William Cola-WWII told me when I first met him and found out that he was a cousin, and that he was from my ancestral village, San Pietro in Abruzzo. The village was destroyed during World War II by the Nazis as part of what the doctor has mentioned already, the Gustav or Winter Line. And I'll tell you how that all came about. When I was learning about his life back in the village, he told me a story. Now this is 2 decades ago. This book is 20 years in the making. I wrote a lot of books in between there. This is my 18th book. But there's kind of like in the back shelf of my mind for years and years that this would make a really great story. I have to find out when this all took place. I'm a history teacher in my career. So anything historical, pops a light up in my head, and I want to pursue it. So I began to find out that the Gustav Line was begun in 1943, as after the Americans had already taken Sicily, and they were making their way up the peninsula. This is the Villa Savoia. I found out that the government of Italy was the Kingdom of Italy. So I found out that the king was Victor Emmanuel III. His son was Prince Umberto, and his daughter-in-law was Princess Marie Jose. Now, in 1943, Mussolini was on the downtrend with the Italian people. After they lost the African colonies and after Sicily was invaded, his 20-year reign as the fascist leader of Italy was in danger. And the king wanted to make sure that it happened. But the king was a constitutional monarch, and he had to figure out a way to get rid of Mussolini legally and constitutionally, because a constitutional monarch just means that you have to go by the law. You're mainly a figurehead, you're not really the political leader. Mussolini is the political leader. So I looked into the home here of Crown Prince Umberto and Crown Princess Marie Jose. This is how they looked when in the I think this is the late 20s, early 30s. And Mussolini had already taken power and was the Prime Minister of Italy for 20 years by the time 1943 rolled around. The war was going very badly for Italy. The prince, in particular Umberto, hated Hitler. And when Mussolini created an accord called the Defense Accord with Germany in 1940, that was the end with the royal family wanting to do anything with Mussolini. So Umberto and Marie Jose began an independent search to try to meet Allied leaders in Sicily about getting an armistice which would bring Italy out of the war as an ally of Germany and placing it on the side of the United States, United Kingdom, French, the Belgians, and Canadians, and all of that you heard about. So Princess Marie Jose went on a secret mission, and her husband, the prince, was on a mission too, but it was a decoy mission. Her mission was real. She was going to bring an armistice, a proposal to General Clark, the head of the American forces in North Africa and then now into Sicily. So that happened in 1943. Simultaneously in 1943, my cousin in San Pietro was, becoming like a spy to find out what the Germans were doing and what they were going to do with the Gustav line. And they found out that the plan of the Gustav line was to destroy every single Italian village in the Apennine Mountains from the Mediterranean to the Adriatic Sea, thereby creating a line of disaster for the Allied troops to have to cross without supplies, without food, without water, without the necessities to keep the troops nourished. I said, well, these are two great stories. I've got to blend them together some way. But, my cousin never met the king and never met Prince Umberto. But in my story, he does. And that's what makes a novel and not a history book. And so all the events that you're going to read in the story are real, but the meeting with the prince, the princess, and my cousin is not. In the Apennine Mountains in Abruzzo is San Pietro-Alata. That's how it looks today. The cover of the book shows you what it looked like in 1943 when the Germans destroyed it. They went house to house and they planted explosives and they blew up everything. The only thing that was saved, and that is thanks to the Pope, was the Catholic Church. Hitler did not want to alienate 50% of the German population who were Catholic. And so he had an agreement with his generals, don't destroy the churches and rile up the Catholics, okay? So the church was saved and became churches of St. Peter and Paul. I spent a month in Italy in my final research for this book, and I was in St. Peter and Paul. I was in some of the destroyed areas they have preserved to see what it looked like when it was blown up, and I was in the revitalized town as well. It was just very moving for me because a lot of the stories my cousin told me seemed unbelievable, and now suddenly they were believable because there was a laundry house. In 1943, the women went to this building with a natural flowing stream down a trough to wash their clothes. And the trough spilled out into a cavern which had the natural spring waters below the village. All of that became part of the adventure that these cousin of mine and his friend Addio, who's also real, and I found out that he is also a cousin, because when I was researching this book, I found out that my grandfather here in Chicago had a sister who never came to America. And her name was Cenza Murder. Her children never came to America. I met all these descendants of them when I was in Italy and found out their story of what was happening during World War II to my family. And my real name is Cola-WWII. You might, because you see Cola on the book, that's my pen name. When you go to the village, there's a school named after my family, there's a grocery store that is owned by my family, ancestors, and so forth and so on. I didn't know anything about any of this until I was there just a few months ago. My grandfather was very tight-lipped about his history, and I didn't have any clue that he left relatives in Italy when he came with his two brothers. So the three brothers came to America, but the sister stayed there for obvious reasons. She was married and having children and so forth. So the story begins with Vivi, William Cola-WWII, and his friend Addio, and their friend, a Frazzini boy. Frazzinis are also relatives of mine who are represented in the village area in Abruzzo in large numbers even to this day, and very present in the city of Chicago to this day. This is San Baccali Falls. Here, Vivi and Addio and Ferdinando, there's three teenage boys, young teenagers. You heard about the doctor's boy in Abruzzo. Well, these are three boys in Abruzzo, and they're all about the same age, 14, 15 years old, and they go camping. The Germans are all around them, and these three kids decide they're going to go camping, right? And their parents are having a heart attack. They don't want them to go out in the forest. The Nazis are coming up here. They're going to, they go and they have their boyish adventures and so forth. And this is where I twisted history a little. At the same time, Princess Marie Jose was traveling through the Apennine Mountains to come down to Campobasso. Eventually was her goal. They had to go down through the mountains, and they couldn't go to the Mediterranean side because the American troops were coming up this way from Anzo and Salerno and from those invasion points. So the princess had to go this way through the mountains and then made her way down to Zernia and Campobasso, where some of the Allied headquarters was located. Well, that was perfect. They were literally within miles of each other, so I just had my cousins meet the princess. And that's when they find out about the secret armistice that Mussolini didn't know about, and that Hitler certainly didn't know about, and how they were, the constitutional monarchy, was plotting to bring Italy to the side of the United States and the Allied forces. This is St. Peter and Paul as it looks today, and it was preserved, and here were some of the conflicts that occurred. There were two deaths as a result of the liberation of San Pietro as part of the story. This church was originally intended to house the sick and the displaced. The Germans would not allow the population of San Pietro to stay in San Pietro. So the priest secretly hid my cousin and his two friends, who became spies to figure out where the Nazis were going into the city, and they actually witnessed the blowing up of the city, including the family grocery store, the pasta factory where their parents worked, their personal homes, everything around that church was totally obliterated. From the top of the mountain, they would spy on the German troop movement, and then they would report by shortwave radio to the Allied forces. Eventually, the Allied forces made their way through Monte Cassino. You know, Monte Cassino is a very famous battle in the Italian theater part of the war. It took years for the Allies to defeat it. You'll find out why in the story, because it was on a mountain. You also know from history that the Germans themselves could not occupy the monastery, but the Allies thought they did, and that's why the monastery was destroyed during the bombing of Monte Cassino. It's because they thought the Germans were headquartered there, but they actually were headquartered down the mountain, below it. So that was one of the mistakes of the invasion of the Allied troops, but it was inevitable. The Nazis wanted them to believe the Abbey housed them because that was a position of strength. When the princess finally arrives in the Apennine Mountains, she goes to the shrine of San Amico, at least in my story, and she's brought to San Amico. San Amico is one of those medieval saints, and to this day you could go to the shrine and the water is supposed to be specially blessed and so forth. And it's not like Lourdes where you're cured, but it's a blessing type water. And I was there, and I visited the shrine and so forth, and it is here where my characters first encounter the Nazi troops who are coming to set up the line and to destroy the villages. This is Venezia Palazzo in the Piazza Venezio in Rome. This is where Mussolini lived when he was the Prime Minister of Italy. And right here, between these two blue stripes here, this is the balcony where he made his infamous speeches. For years, you could not go into this palace because they closed off anything that had to do with Mussolini because the Italians were embarrassed at what he did to Italy. It's open now. I actually got to go. I write about how what was going on in that palace when they were working to overthrow Mussolini. I actually was in the room where they took the vote of the Grand Council, which was in a parliamentary system. The parties vote for the Prime Minister. So Mussolini has to have a vote of confidence every time he made a law or something. And this was called the Grand Council. The Grand Council was finally convinced by the king to give him a negative vote. That would remove him from power as prime minister. So the story is how my characters and the prince and princess managed to get Mussolini ousted. All of this is in July of 1943. During this time, Pope Pius XII had a Monsignor in the Secretary of State office by the name of Montini, who would later become Pope Paul VI. This is real history. Pope Paul VI, as Monsignor Montini, his family name, it was involved in communicating with the Allies on behalf of the Vatican because the Pope was trying to save the sacred shrines in Rome because the Allies were planning to bomb Rome. That's another motivating factor of the royal family, was to stop the bombing of Rome, and the only way they could do that is if they got Italy out of the war on the side of Germany and placed it on the side of the Allies. And that was thanks to Monsignor Montini helping that take place. My characters end up going into San Lorenzo Basilica. San Lorenzo is one of the oldest churches in Christendom. It is the burial site of the first deacon of the church, St. Lawrence, San Lorenzo. And it is a place where the secret meetings would take place to talk about the removal of Mussolini from office. In July of 1943, Rome was bombed, and San Lorenzo was one of the mistakes of the bombs, and it was partially destroyed. Part of the story of how that basilica was used in the fight against Mussolini and the removal of the fascist regime is also part of the story. This is the king, Victor Emmanuel III. That is Galileo Gianto. He is the son-in-law of Mussolini, and he was instrumental in bringing his father-in-law down on the middle of July 1943. For that, he would eventually be arrested by the fascist regime and executed. This is the actual room, the Pappagallo, the room of the parrot, in the Venezia Palace, where the vote was taken, no confidence vote, and Mussolini was removed from office. He had no idea, he knew something was going to happen, but he didn't know what was going to happen. And history says that he seemed to be out of it. We would say stunado, in our family, when you're out of it and not quite with it. And not really in touch with what was going on. The Grand Council was meeting, and hadn't met in years, all of a sudden it's meeting. Right after Rome is bombed, there's got to be a connection, right? Well, my cousins in the story end up being his servers, his food and so forth in his palace, and so they get all the inside dope. And I have to say that when I was researching this, I found this all out, the life of Mussolini at the end and so forth. I began to get a soft spot for the guy. I mean, oh my God, what he was going through psychologically and even physically and so forth. And I had to kick myself and say, hey, this guy was a jerk. He was a friend of Hitler, But as a history teacher, I'm trying to balance everything, and I'm trying to see what was happening through the eyes of these two teenagers who are the main characters of the story, and how they're reacting with their relationship, because they became the caregivers for Mussolini. So Mussolini is removed from office. The king has him imprisoned and sent to the island of Panza, off the city of Gaeta, near the Naples Bay. And this is where he begins his descent psychologically and emotionally, Mussolini, as he is imprisoned in house arrest on this island. And the people would come by, and he would sit on a little balcony, and he would wave to the people, but not like he did for the balcony in Rome. Kind of like, oh, well, guys, say hello, they're saying hello to me. And he would sit there in his underwear. And he would walk the streets of the city, the village, because the king said he is not to be harmed, he is not to be mutilated, not to be tortured, or anything like that. They didn't want to make a hero out of Mussolini. They just wanted to get rid of Mussolini as a power base. So he would walk around town and so forth and so on. And the guards would accompany him, and they have to stay 20 feet away from him and so forth. So that's what was going on there. But at the same time, the Germans found out, or thought they found out, where he was being held. So they created a plan to free Mussolini. And they got this guy called Colonel Otto Sforzeni to be the leader of this plot to rescue Mussolini from imprisonment. Well, the Secret Service, Carabinieri of the Italian National Secret Service, found out that they were plotting to take Mussolini off the island to rescue him. So they transferred him. Next slide. And they brought him to the Magdalena Island, which is a small island off the coast of Sardinia. And how they managed to do that, and all this part is true, how they sneaked Mussolini onto the island, how they had to sneak him off the island, how they concealed him on this ship, which was just an Italian naval ship, and how the ship was set course for a different city in Italy, but ended up in Magdalena Island in order to confuse the Germans. And so this is Otto. Otto survived the war, by the way. He was given the Iron Cross by Hitler, and he was not condemned at the trials of Nuremberg. He was not found to be not guilty, but just following orders, because the only thing he really did of note was rescuing Mussolini. So Otto plans this plot. He disguises himself as a lieutenant, and he comes to Magdalena Island, but my teenage characters spot him because they have seen him in the Vatican working with Montini as Montini was trying to save the churches from being bombed from either side. They inform the Lieutenant Giano, who is the head of the Italian forces that are protecting Mussolini on the island, and they have to take Mussolini off by seaplane. So the two cousins of mine, Mussolini, the lieutenant character, they're all on the seaplane, and they are secretly flown out just as the Germans are landing on Magdalena Island to free Mussolini. And the whole story about they do the spy network, it's really intriguing how the Germans did it, and how the Italians interacted with them and diverted their attention from the right places and things of that nature. But they flew them to Bracciano Lake, and then they did, and by caravan, they went to the Gran Sasso. The Gran Sasso, as you heard before, is in central Abruzzo. It's a large, massive, mountainous area. And on top of it is the Campo Imperatore, which is actually a hotel built by Mussolini to encourage recreation and skiing in the winter. It's known for skiing in wintertime. So Mussolini is set here. My characters are part of the group that are set to protect him. It is totally isolated. It's a mile high on top of a plateau mountain, and they thought no one would be able to rescue him. But Otto had better plans. Otto was going to rescue him by glider planes. 12 glider planes secretly land in an attack on Campo Imperatore, took them totally by surprise. Only 2 people got killed, 2 Italians. You'll hear about their story in my story. And Mussolini is rescued 1 week after the king manages to get approved the armistice with the Allies. And Italy is now on the side of the Allied forces. 1 week later, Mussolini is rescued from the Gran Sasso, and he is flown to Austria to meet Hitler. This is his actual rescue picture. That's Otto in the center, that's Mussolini. Now Mussolini is about 60 years old in this picture. He's dressed up all in winter clothes with a hat and so forth and so on, not at all flamboyant like he usually is when you see newsreels of him and so forth. He is brought to Germany. He is honored by Hitler. Hitler decides to destroy the monarchy. He declares the monarchy void in northern Italy because the Germans control northern Italy. And Mussolini becomes the head of the government, the Republic of Northern Italy, and the king is removed from power. At the end of my story, my characters have to go back to their village is destroyed. They continue their spying on the Germans, and they do meet with General Clark's forces and General Montgomery, British forces coming from the Adriatic side. The Belgians do come into the village. They liberate it from the Germans, and by 1946, it is already being rebuilt. The plot to save their village did not work, but they did save Italy with the armistice of 1943. That's the typical street in the ruins that the kids have to go through as they did their spying and so forth. These are actual pictures from the museum in San Pietro today. And this is the fountain, the Grand Fontana. I mentioned that the women did their laundry with this trough and the natural spring coming up and so forth. The same water feeds this fountain. It's an underground spring. That fountain has a very important role in my story. And that's me at the actual trough that remains still working and still flowing the water, and it shoots up like a volcanic eruption every few minutes, bringing this water up, and then it flows down, and then it goes into a cavern below. For me, I told the mayor who was giving me the tour at the time that this is the biggest thrill I had writing the story. I actually proved in my own vision that what I had my characters doing was actually possible because of this building. And that's where the fight was with the Germans and the villagers and the Allied troops and the Italian troops when the city was liberated. It's still there today. And the crown is saved, but only temporarily. This is the Vittorio Emanuele monument in Rome of the unifier of Italy, the first king of Italy. And I fell in love with this monument because I know the troops, the Allied troops call it the wedding cake, but I fell in love with it. I thought it was so cool. I climbed all the way to the top of it, and you could see all of Rome. It was really cool. And so I made it part of the story. And that's VivI's War. Any questions?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Yes.
Possibly, if Mussolini had just stayed put on that island, he might have survived the war.
Yes.
And he wouldn't have been mutilated and hung by the French.
Right. Well, now you'll find out how that happened. But the whole thing was a plot by the communists. Now, you know, when one political party is destroyed, the fascists were destroyed, there are others in the wings, and who were in the wings were the communists. And you well know from what happened in the 1960s, Italy almost fell to the communist power. So there was a whole plot by the communists to overthrow the monarchy and establish a communist government. But they kept quiet during the war as their strategy. Let's get rid of Mussolini first, and they're the ones who organized the assassination.
Yeah, when I was looking into my book, it follows on the heels of your book back to the historical part. I didn't realize there was a civil war in Italy.
Three
There
civil
was a
wars.
civil war, so within the war, there was a civil war.
Yeah.
There were the communist faction, the monarchy faction, the people who supported Mussolini originally, and so on, and they all fought each other. The Italians were killing themselves. They were killing each other. And it was horrible until April of 1945, so for 2 years, the Italians were killing themselves more than, they were dying. It was, and I never realized that until,
And that's what the king was trying to prevent.
right.
He was trying to prevent the Civil War being openly fought. At the same time, they were trying to fight a war with Hitler, It's all laid out for you in the story, but it's phenomenal what the Italian people went through in those 2 years. It's unbelievable, but it's all true. Yes.
In 2012, it was in Rome, and they now have what they call Mussolini's home. You can go through on a tour.
Yes.
And it looked very similar to what that first slide you showed of the.
Villa Torrini is the name of his villa.
You can go through that.
Yes. Yeah.
Well,
We can
It's
go
not-
through it now.
Not advertised.
No,
They
it's
don't-
not. They're still not proud of Mussolini. But his granddaughter is an alderman in Rome.
Oh, I remember that.
yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming and staying the full length of the time. We're going to try and take a picture, I think, against the wall there.